Welcome to the Jeff Rubin Show. I am Jeff Rubin, and today I am here with Sean Howe to discuss one of my favorite topics, nerdy shit. More specifically, Marvel Comics, which Sean has just written a book about. Sean, what is the name of that book?
It's Marvel Comics, The Untold Story.
And how do you describe the book?
I describe it, well, it depends on if I'm talking to somebody who is a comic book fan. That's the first thing that's the first fork in the road, I guess.
Well, I feel like if they're listening to this, like, there's a pretty good chance. Not definite, but there's a pretty good chance that, like, they know the difference between Marvel and DC anyway.
Okay, so this is about how a certain group of people did all the creative work for Marvel and didn't always get the credit that they deserved. Is maybe the narrative thread there.
And this is like the beginnings of Marvel. Like, this is like
it's a 70-year history of Marvel from 1939 to the present.
And let's just start at the beginning. How did you choose this topic? I'm assuming you read a lot of comic books growing up.
I think what's really interesting to me about the story of Marvel is the way that, you know, unlike DC Comics, for instance, you know, Marvel has this grand arching narrative where every story is tied together.
Now, doesn't DC Comics? Sorry to interrupt you, but doesn't DC Comics? They have a continuity. What is the
they do that a
difference
little
between
bit.
Marvel and the DC.
They do that a little bit. I think when, you know, up until maybe the 80s, they didn't do that so much. I think that they wanted to get a little piece of the Marvel magic, and they started to pattern a lot of things after Marvel. But the idea that that everything was like an episode of a big soap opera, I think really came together under Stanley and Jack Kirby in the 60s at Marvel. But it had been there, you know, back to, you know, 1939, 1940. The Submariner and the Human Torch were sort of crossing over into each other's titles, and, you know, what that set the stage for was this huge universe of characters that always were bumping into each other. And I guess I tell people it's like if Lost, the show Lost, went on for like 70 years, and every character had their own spin-off series, and all of those, you know, characters
I'd watch
over
70 years worth of Lost, by the way. I would be into that.
And,
you know, it lost its way around season 42, but by season 53,
right.
They're back on track.
Right.
I would watch that.
Right.
It's interesting because, not to jump too far ahead, but to jump to completely far ahead to the present day, you see that happening now in movies, and they're doing that in movies now, and that's something that's never really been done before in movies, where there's like a cinematic universe. I think they even call it the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And so it's interesting to see that that's one of the defining characteristics of Marvel, and now it is, you see it, and now they've translated that to film. Do you think that is why, or a reason those movies have been so successful?
I think that the whole idea of serial fiction has really blown up, you know, obviously in the last few years. But I think that Marvel, I think that the seed for that comes from Marvel. I think a lot of television showrunners grew up reading comic books, and so even though, you know, there's the Victorian novel, and you can you know, trace it all back to that, the way that kids learn to tell stories or to absorb stories is often, or used to be often, through comic books. I think that's, you know, probably not true of younger generations. But the people who are making television shows now, I think if you were to talk to them about formative storytelling experiences, they would put it back to Marvel Comics.
Yeah, this has actually come up on the podcast before, but George R.R. Martin, who wrote Game of Thrones, the books, and is heavily involved in the TV series, there's this letter, like, you can find this image on the internet, of a letter that he wrote to Fantastic Four, to Stan Lee, back in the 60s, about how much he loved it. And, like, I see authors all the time citing Stan Lee as, like, a major influence of their work. So when did you start reading comic books? What era was it?
So I was born in 1974, so I guess probably looking at them when I was about 4, and then really hooked by the time I was 8. Like, really paying attention to what was coming out, you know, next month.
Who are your guys?
John Byrne, Frank Miller,
I meant
Chris
superheroes.
Claremont.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. You know, it's funny because people have been asking me who my favorite character is, and I usually just end up saying, you know, as good as these characters are, they're sort of like canvases for the artists, and I think that if you have the right the artist and writer, pretty much any character is going to be interesting.
Yeah, I think a great example of that would be Daredevil, who I think when a lot of people hear about Daredevil, or when that Daredevil movie came out, sounds kind of lame. But because of Frank Miller and all these other people that worked on, he's like a classic, one of the big Marvel characters.
Right. And yeah, now, because the movies are what's in people's consciousness, when I, end up finally settling on my favorite character, it's Daredevil, and I have to say, well, it's not just like this Ben Affleck movie.
Do you like the movie? I don't hate that movie.
I do not like that movie.
I don't hate it, which is an unpopular opinion. I like elements of it, I guess. I heard the director's cut is better, but I've actually seen Daredevil twice, and I was like, I'm sorry, guys, I'm not watching Daredevil a third time. But I actually kind of like the Daredevil movie. An unpopular opinion to have. So when you started writing this book, was it difficult? Did you find it difficult to write about a visual medium without, having the panels?
Well, I didn't know that there would be no panels when I was writing the book.
So you anticipated having like art to support?
I did. I actually went through a process of submitting a color, 16 pages of color artwork with captions that went through an approval process with Marvel's lawyers, and we settled on an amount that I would pay Marvel, and everything seemed like it was going to go smoothly. And then I got the contract, and essentially I would have had to agree to not say anything critical of Marvel Entertainment anywhere in the book. And so I made the decision to not have illustrations.
Yeah, this isn't like the Marvel history of Marvel, where like there's a lot of backroom drama. It seems like it must have been a very difficult book to research, because there's a lot of he said, she said about things that happened 50 years ago there's no record of. How did you research the book?
Yeah, well, a lot of interviews. I talked to about 150 people, and I also, there's kind of this shadow journalistic record of the comics industry through fanzines, and so compiling, just big stacks of old fan press, because obviously those people were not being interviewed, in the New York Times every week. So you've got to find these old mimeographed interviews, sometimes done by 16-year-olds, and that's where you end up finding a lot of the good stuff.
You even kind of acknowledge it in the book when you start talking about Fantastic Four #1, which for those that don't know is like the big bang for Marvel Comics. It's like really the beginning of what we now recognize as what a comic book is and should be. And you mentioned in the book, like, this much is certain. You say something like, this much is certain. Kirby and Stan Lee threw together 25 pages, and it came out. So, like, how do you begin to untangle these things that have just for years been argued about? Like, how do you decide what to write about there and whose side to I don't even know if you take sides, but just how to pull that apart.
Yeah, I think the approach that I wanted to take was simply to present every side as much as I could, and let the reader make up their own minds. Because once I would, if I took the step of making a judgment on who was telling the truth, that's going to filter out a lot of important information, and I think. I think that because there's no way of really knowing, for instance, I guess the controversy maybe at the center.
What is that controversy?
Maybe the biggest controversy in the history of Marvel would be, was Stan Lee the genius, or was Jack Kirby the genius, or maybe another way of saying that would be, did Stan Lee totally swipe all of Jack Kirby's ideas? Which I think that's an overstatement, but I think it's important to sort of have that conversation in the book. But I did not want to be the one to to pound down the gavel.
Well, one reason it's so hard to pull apart is because of this thing called the Marvel method, and this is how they wrote all those great comic books in the 60s. Can you explain what that is? Because even if you know the difference between Marvel and DC is, you might not know how, seemingly ridiculous method they use to create these comic books.
Right. So,
This
typically,
does not sound like it should work. It doesn't seem like it should work.
Right,
I
so-
want to preface it with that.
So typically, what would happen in the making of a comic book is the writer would come up with a script, give it to the artist, who would do about 20 pages, and give it to an inker, and then a colorist, and a letterer, and then it would go out the door. And with Marvel, what happened was Stan Lee would start just feeding, maybe a couple sentences of something to an artist. The artist would then draw out this story, and in doing so would create the pacing and the subplots and introduce characters.
Which is an important piece of writing a comic book. It's like directing a movie almost.
It's like directing a movie, right? It's like what Woody Allen did with What's Up, Tiger Lily is what Stan Lee ended up doing, which is you get all these images and then you kind of write some dialogue to go over those images.
So they would together decide on a script. Jack Kirby, whoever the artist was, but usually Jack Kirby in these early days, would draw it, and then they would add the lines on top of that based on the drawings, which I think is, I guess, one reason it's so difficult to pull apart exactly who is responsible for what.
Right. And even, I guess I think I said earlier that Stanley would feed them an idea, which even that is hard to really say for sure. I think in some instances, the artist would just, completely take the reins, and Stan Lee would have nothing to do with it until, it came back to him as a 20 pages of comic book art. And that's what actually happened with Steve Ditko for the last year or so on Spider-Man. So when you have like Gwen Stacy, who now everyone knows as Emma Stone, she was introduced in a comic book that Stan Lee had nothing to do with until he got those pages on his desk, and there she was.
There's also a piece in the book about Gwen Stacy's probably, I guess this is like a spoiler for like the Spider-Man movie that's coming out in 2 years, but Gwen Stacy, one of the most famous deaths in comic books. Presumably they're going to kill her off in the movies just because she's like so linked to her dying in the comic books. And there's actually a piece of the book where you talk about how Stan Lee didn't want to kill her, and now it's remembered as like this great story. Do you think that's something where Stan Lee, and even you have him on the record like apologizing for it at comic book conventions, is that something where in retrospect he would admit he was wrong and say that she needed to die?
I don't know, actually. I think that I feel like he knows that he's on the record attacking the idea, so I don't think he would do like a double reverse on himself. But it clearly was the right path for that character. It was a really resonant story.
Yeah, it's one of the most famous comic book stories of all time now.
People didn't really care that much about Gwen Stacy before she died. I mean, kids were heartbroken, and they were traumatized by her death. But I think that I don't think that they were as invested before that as they thought they were.
Is she alive now?
No, I don't think so. She's she came back in the 90s, or she came back a few years after that as a clone, and then
as they will.
Yeah, as they will. At Stan Lee's insistence. That's the whole reason that the Spider-Man cloning ever began was because Stan Lee insisted that Gwen Stacy come back for a while.
And for those that don't know, the Spider-Man cloning is probably maybe the worst remembered story in the history of Marvel. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
I think it's like really the low point. It's what, in the 90s?
Yeah, the mid 90s. It was a clone of Spider-Man named Ben Reilly, or rather the Peter Parker clone was named Ben Reilly, and it just became this huge tangled mess of a story, and I talk a little bit about the behind the scenes of that in the book, where nobody really knew how to untangle the mess, and it became a little bit of an office politics battle behind the scenes.
So I want to go back to the Marvel method real quick because I am fascinated by it. Why do you think that worked? I mean, it seems like the most counterintuitive way to create something that I could imagine. And yet, it produced not just good comic books, but like the best comic books of all time. Like these characters were still the most popular characters in the world, 40, 50 years later?
Yeah, it worked it worked because the guys who were doing the heavy lifting were so good at what they did. I mean,
And that's Jack Kirby.
and that's Jack Kirby and that's Steve Ditko, and in a way, it's it's also Stan Lee. There's become a narrative that some people subscribe to, that Stan Lee really just all he did was exploit and get in the way of the genius of Jack Kirby, which is not something that I believe. I think that that Stan Lee was a really brilliant talent scout and art director and writer of dialogue, and
Something of a marketing genius too. Like the idea that he himself became a character in the back of the comics was like not something you would necessarily expect. And I think that's a large reason that he became, and Marvel Comics became, like this congealed thing.
Right. How many other pieces of entertainment can you think of where the like a kid consuming the entertainment, it spends a lot of the time thinking like, wow, what a great office this would be to work at. Mm-hmm. I don't think that that's really the case of anything else. You don't go to like Star Wars movies and think, wow, to be an editor at like George Lucas's ranch must be the best.
Yeah.
But with Marvel Comics, they somehow sold the readers on the idea that the most fun place in the Marvel universe was something called the bullpen, which didn't actually even really exist at the time. It was freelancers who would drop off their work and then a couple of production people hanging out. But to read the letters pages, you would think that it was just this, elves factory of hijinks.
Do you read a lot of these old comic books in researching the book?
I reread a lot of comic books.
Were they good? Because you didn't seem thrilled with Fantastic Four #1. Again, like
It's-
one of the most, maybe the most important comic in the history of Marvel Comics, maybe in the history of all comics. And I think you called it like you said it was shambling, I believe. Like it doesn't
Right.
necessarily hold up. Is that correct?
It's not very good.
Yeah.
I mean, have you read it since?
No, I mean I know.
Or ever?
No, I've
Yeah.
never read it. I've never read it. I don't know that I've read much 60s. I'm sure I've seen
Yeah.
something at some point, but like I've certainly never sat down like a big hardcover like classic Spider-Man book and like read a lot of 60s Spider-Man. So it was interesting to hear a lot about that. But they're not good. They don't hold up. Do you see like the seeds of greatness in them?
I in retrospect, you can, but I think it's only because you. I mean, I'm just talking of that one issue. It improved pretty quickly after that, but it's like listening to. Have you ever heard the Beatles recording of My Bonnie?
No, I've not.
Just like it's just there was a while before the Beatles, were really doing good stuff in the studio.
But Fantastic Four also wasn't Stan Lee's first comic book. I actually was surprised to learn that he was already 38 when Fantastic Four came out. He's almost 40.
Right.
And that really surprised me because, what was he doing before that? He was working in comic books, but he wasn't Stan Lee yet.
Well, in fact, he was Stan Lee in that he had been born Stanley Lieber and had legally changed his name to Stan Lee, but Stan Lee is a basically a persona he created to be like his writer name, his comic book writer name, and then if he ever got around to writing a novel like he wanted to, he would go back to Stanley Lieber for that. But Stan Lee had been at Marvel Comics for 20 years when Fantastic Four came out. He had been the editor-in-chief kind of by default because his cousin was married to the publisher of Marvel Comics. And when the previous editor left Marvel, Stan Lee, who had gotten a job as an office boy there, just stepped into the vacuum and didn't leave for 20 years. When Fantastic Four came out and things started to roll, then he decided, maybe this is a pretty good gig after all.
So what was it about Fantastic Four #1 that makes it such a milestone? What's so revolutionary about it?
There's not much that's revolutionary about it. Is the funny thing. It was quickly a success, and for reasons that I still find hard to fathom. I mean, what really sets it apart from other comic books of the time is literally just how crude it is. You can look where there was a DC comic called Challengers of the Unknown, and you can see how a lot of stuff that Jack Kirby had done earlier in Challengers of the Unknown, he was just kind of putting into Fantastic Four once again. So even the concepts weren't really original. But what started to happen as Fantastic Four went on was you started to see these characters being much different than the Truth, Justice, and the American Way icons of DC. So whereas Superman and Batman at the time and Wonder Woman were all really noble and boring, the Fantastic Four were, kind of this family unit that were always bickering and threatening to punch each other out.
Do you think they knew what they were doing was going to be so revolutionary that like this idea of flawed heroes would become, again, the template for comic books for the next few decades?
I don't think so. I mean, and one of the ways that you can tell that is because nobody saved like the scripts for those comic books, and had a hard time remembering the details years later. It was really just it was one of about probably 8 comics that they put out that month.
And he goes, the run that starts after Fantastic Four is insane. Right after Fantastic Four, I believe there was like Hulk. Right after Fantastic Four, they came up with Hulk, then Ant-Man. We'll give him, he's still around, all right.
Right.
Then Thor, then the X-Men, then the Avengers, just like one after another. They're like top 5 media properties of today. Like they're just coming out with them. Oh, and then Spider-Man, of course.
Right.
How long was it like before Spider-Man was, Spider-Man? Like he was the most... until everyone knew who Spider-Man was. How long does that take?
So Spider-Man was introduced in 1962, and I think probably by 65 he was really a sensation.
That's incredible because it's hard to imagine a new comic book coming out. I think like the most recent comic book character that like is generally known by the mainstream public is probably Wolverine, who's like 30 years old now.
40.
40. Maybe Spawn was pushing it a little, but not really. So the idea that like a comic book character would come out and then 2 years later everyone know who it is incredible. Was that the case with all of these early Marvel books?
Yeah. What happened was Stan Lee realized that what he could do is introduce Spider-Man into an issue of Fantastic Four, or bring the Hulk into an issue of Fantastic Four, and so that's serving 2 purposes. You've got the beginning of this really complicated storyline going on, but then you've also got cross marketing for your characters, and so by about 1965, if somebody was reading Spider-Man, they couldn't help but be aware of the Hulk and the Avengers and probably the X-Men, although the X-Men were they never really actually caught on until years later. But yeah, it was really about the Marvel brand by that time, and anything that they touched seemed to be gold.
It's incredible that they weren't just like the first modern superhero comics, but they're also the best characters. You think those are related?
Yes, I mean, I guess they became the modern superhero characters just because they stood out. If they hadn't been breaking a mold, I guess there'd be no reason to date comic book history to that as a revolution.
The book really made me realize that Stan Lee, obviously I know who Stan Lee is, everyone knows who Stan Lee is, but I don't know, I just kind of know him as like a personality. Like I know he created all these characters, and I knew he was well respected, but I didn't realize just like what a master author he is, just like how far his empire spread and how much he did. What was it that made him so good?
Well, he is just a real salesman. in
It's not
every,
all. Yeah, that's interesting. It's not all. I mean, he's good. He's a good writer, but it's not just that. There's like a marketing angle to it, and there's a business angle to it, and all those things too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in his writing, I think there's a really appealing humanist streak that comes through. He's got a kind of a corny sense of humor, but he mastered this tone of self-deprecation that works really well for a lot of people. And so even as the jokes are corny, you're kind of indulging him happily. But he was really. He says he's not a smart businessman, and in some ways he has not been a smart businessman in terms of maybe just the way he's handled his own contracts and things like that. But in terms of speaking to an audience and having a good sense of what that audience wants, he's brilliant. He used to have fights with Steve Ditko because. The Spider-Man artist, because Steve Ditko thought that Stanley would bend everything to what the audience wanted too much of the time, and it became this thing where letter writers were essentially voting on where Spider-Man would go, where the title would go. And Steve Ditko, I think that insulted his artistic sensibilities and maybe his Ayn Randian values as well.
Yeah, it was interesting to read how there's a lot of that in the early Spider-Man comic books. Is Stanley Mega-Rich? Does he own anything? Himself? Does he have a piece of the Avengers? He's probably not as rich as you assume the guy who created Spider-Man, the X-Men, Thor, et cetera, would be.
That's true. He probably has more money than anyone listening to this right now.
Right.
I mean, he's certainly a multimillionaire. I mean, he had a contract for a while with Marvel that gave him a big piece of the movies.
Interesting.
And that was, and then there was a lawsuit, and in the settlement, I think that was actually voided, but he got a pretty good payday.
He keeps showing up for the cameos. You must not be too upset.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to read. It feels like these movies are really. Something he had been wanting to do for years. You read about him trying to get him off the ground in the 60s and the 70s. He must be so happy to see it really finally clicking and the Avengers being the biggest movie of the year, if not necessarily the best, but maybe the best too.
Yeah, I think he was always more taken with Hollywood than he was with comic books. I mean, from the time he was a little kid, and he would sneak out and go to see westerns and dream about being one of those matinee idols. And then comic books kind of happened to come along, but I found this recording of him talking to a friend in the late '60s, sort of just a very candid conversation where Stanley is talking about how if this wasn't his job, he would never read comic books. He didn't understand why people did, which I thought was a really surprising thing to read.
Yeah, he's synonymous with the media.
Yeah, and he's been a really good ambassador for the medium as well. I mean, regardless of how much he really, would love to read comic books in his own time, he was really important for bringing comic books back to the extent that they did, in the culture.
Did he ever write a book? I remember he wrote a screenplay at some point. But
Right,
did he ever
right.
Did he ever write a novel?
He never did. No,
that's interesting.
And I asked him if he regretted that, and he said no. That's I kind of feel like it would be hard to imagine Stanley expressing regret over anything. Actually, he's
so positive.
He's so positive.
What was it like talking to him? Was he forthcoming about this history?
I didn't talk to him as much as I had hoped, but talking to him a little bit is it's a little bit like talking to maybe Ronald Reagan in 1988 about the Iran-Contra affair or something. First of all, he's on message all the time.
Yeah, because he's still employed by Marvel.
And second of all, he doesn't have a very good memory. So between those two things, there's not a lot to sort of squeeze out of him. But what it's like to talk to him is like it's like talking to a long lost like uncle or something, because his voice is something. If you grew up, watching any of the cartoons that he narrated, or for a few generations of readers at least, his the actual sound of his voice is very, very familiar.
Yeah.
And it's something that it's strange to hear that voice saying your name directly. It's a nice warm childhood feeling that you get.
This is something of a sidetrack, but I have to bring it up. Possibly my favorite nugget that I learned in the book, my favorite fun fact, was that at some point they were going to make a Silver Surfer movie starring Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. You are in my apartment. You are sitting underneath my Beach Boys poster. I love the Beach Boys. What was that?
I wish I knew more about that.
Because I Googled it, and I only found references to your book. Like other people like me, like, I just read this book, and it said there was going to be a Dennis Wilson Silver Surfer movie.
Yeah, there was a newspaper report at the time that mentioned that among, there was a guy named Steve Lemberg who is a rock show promoter. I think he worked for Bill Graham or something, and he licensed a bunch of the characters in the early 70s. And he wanted to do just rock operas of everything, and one of the projects that he had in mind was apparently, I guess it would have been like Dennis Wilson's follow up to Tulane Blacktop or something.
Yeah,
it would have been a really, really weird movie.
I love hearing about nerdiness has become so mainstream today that I love whenever I read about old school nerdiness when it was really uncool and you were really a leper if you were super into comic books. I find those people, they paved the way for me to be having this podcast today, for you to write this book. I love reading about the first Comic-Con and the old Comic-Cons. Well, what was that scene like? Because, now if you go to Comic-Con, it's Kristen Stewart and she's premiering Twilight.
Yeah, there's something that's really beautiful about the idea of those old comic conventions where it's really just actually about the comic books. Mm-hmm. And especially now to look at how Hollywood has totally co-opted the San Diego Comic-Con in particular, but almost all comic conventions have as much to do with getting B-movie character actors signing memorabilia and stuff like that.
Pro wrestlers, a lot of pro wrestlers,
sometimes porn stars, which I feel like is a little bit icky collision to have little kids and porn stars.
Comic book fans, they have many interests.
Sure. But there was a time where in the early 70s you could corner Jack Kirby, outside the hotel pool, and he would give you an audience,
So what did they do there? Today, if you go to Comic-Con, you walk around. I guess you buy and sell comic books. Maybe you go to panels. Was it the same type of thing then? Yeah.
Have you been to a comic convention?
I've been to New York. I've not been to San Diego.
Okay, you've been to the big New York Comic-Con.
Yeah, the Javits Center.
Yeah, I mean it's hard to. I guess yes. In that you walk around and go to panels and there are comic books for sale. That's true. But if you think about just the recirculating air of the Javits Center, or if you think about just the constant explosions of video games, or you think about all of the all of the booth girls who are dressed up and
trying to get your attention,
and trying to get your attention to buy some video game, and then you erase all of that stuff, and then you've just got kind of I guess you keep the fluorescent lighting. I guess that was probably always
so it's the same thing, just smaller and not as shiny.
Smaller and not as shiny, and just homier. I guess I don't know. I'm just getting nostalgic for something I wasn't even around for. Right. So I don't know, but I like the idea of people gathering to talk about a particular art form, and I like the idea that it's organized. It used to be organized by fans. That's the biggest difference, I think. And now it's big business.
Were there any women at those Comic-Cons?
There were some.
To anyone? Yeah, that was a thing.
Yeah, and they were generally pretty popular.
I imagine they were. Not unlike, and there's many women at Comic-Con today. The ratio's still not totally balanced. There's still Comic-Con's the only place where there's a long line outside the men's room and not the women's,
Right.
And when was the first Comic-Con?
I think the first San Diego Comic-Con was maybe 70. Maybe 64 was the first comic convention.
And when was Fantastic Four #1?
61.
Okay, so this is like really like the dawn of comics.
Yeah, and Steve Ditko was, who's now sort of, he's labeled a recluse usually, and he went to that first comic convention, and apparently he had such a terrible time interacting with fans that he said he would never do it again.
It's interesting that the continuity was such a big part. You also talk about in the book there was this box, like a plastic box that they used to keep the continuity straight, like with index cards in it. I want to know everything about that box.
Well, I think it was just index cards, like you said, with each one would have the name of a character, and there were like little dossiers on where the character had appeared and what their powers were. And that's something. There's a writer named David Anthony Kraft who told me about that, and I actually got an email from Roy Thomas, who was the editor in chief at the time, and he said, "Oh, I don't remember that. I don't remember a box like that." And so I guess I'll try to get to the bottom of that. But apparently, it's a controversial concept.
Do you know if there's a modern day equivalent? Because I know at Lucasfilm, there is someone whose full-time job is like keeping track of the Star Wars continuity, which between the millions of cartoons and books and comic books and such, and now the upcoming movies, is apparently a full-time job. Also, his title is Holocron Keeper. Do they still have someone there who just like worries about that? And they're like, oh, no, that's not where Dazzler's from.
I think not a full-time job, but I think that they have a few editors who are really good at that, and they've just sort of internalized that knowledge and skill.
We were saying that that's in the movies now, but you also see that on TV, like the idea of a tight continuity. Like, I guess Game of Thrones is based on a book, but is a great example of like...
Oh, sure. Breaking Bad and The Wire and Sopranos and even Mad Men. Even Mad Men is like a Marvel comic.
How so?
In that way. Well, I'm just in that season 5 is going to be a lot different than season 1, and there are characters who have, if not died, they've been fired from the firm, and then they just disappear for a while, it's really just simply that there are character arcs and story arcs, and whereas 30 years ago, like you wouldn't watch an episode of Quincy and be like, oh, I didn't see the one before this, I'm totally lost.
Yeah, well, I think the technology is a large reason why. We have DVDs and streaming and like all these ways to, like, if you missed an episode of Quincy, like you had to wait 6 months till they reran it, and then if you missed it then, you were just never going to see that episode. And now you use a million ways to catch up. So it's interesting to see how like the technology has almost caught up to this bare bones comic book form. The Marvel characters, they kind of have like a living continuity almost, where like the continuity can be revised based on how fans react to certain stories. Like, I think the Clone Saga is almost certainly disavowed by now. But there's, when you read about the first incarnations of some of these characters, they're very different than what we know now. Like, Thor used to have a secret identity. How do you think that process works? Like, how does Don Blake, who was Thor's secret identity, how does he eventually no longer become part of the mythos?
Those are weird things, because it's just at the same time that there is this continuity that we've been talking about, there's also this constant... It's not quite rebooting, but it's kind of selective memory, I guess.
Yeah. Well, like Iron Man, when he was originally, was he in World War II when he built the...
He was in Vietnam.
He was in Vietnam, and now you see when they update the story, he's in Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever. So these things like have to be updated just to stay current. But why do you think some things stick and some don't? Like, who makes those decisions?
I think it's probably just a variety of different reasons for that. I think one of the interesting things to me is that Spider-Man, who's arguably their most visible property, is the one who's changed the most.
How so? Like, what is different about Spider-Man now than...
Well, he's not a teenager.
He grew up a little.
He went through college and grad school, and he got married. He had a baby briefly, but or I should say,
I believe it was forfeited in a deal with a demon of some kind.
Right.
But yeah, that's it. Spider-Man grew up, which I don't know. Batman doesn't really.
Spider-Man hasn't been a teenager again. Unlike all those other characters, he's never really reverted back to his totally initial state.
But then they do something like Ultimate Spider-Man, which is a spin-off, and comic book fan. I'm just hearing as someone who doesn't follow this shit. He's like listening to me. Ultimate Spider-Man, which is a spin-off. It takes place in a different continuity where Spider-Man is a teenager, and it's like telling the story of Spider-Man as a teenager, updated. He's like a blogger he works at a blog instead of a newspaper and that kind of thing. And, updating it for modern times, telling those stories again, putting twists on classic elements of the story. So they're kind of having their cake and eating it too, in a way, because there's at least two that I know of Spider-Man continuities. There's probably no less than 5 Spider-Man continuities that I'm...
There's way more, actually. Yeah.
But those are two of the big ones anyway. So Marvel characters do grow up. Is Spider-Man eventually going to be old?
No, I think that marriage was when they realized they'd gone too far.
And they undid the marriage.
They undid the marriage.
Again, with this deal with Satan, or Mephisto, as it were.
I think he got to keep his master's degree. I don't think they took that away from him. So he'll always be like that perpetual... post-grad.
What about some of the other characters like Hulk or Thor? They've changed too, haven't they?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I haven't really kept up on the latest developments with those characters. And I know Iron Man potentially could always have a goatee now, thanks to...
Oh, definitely. He's
got
to have the goatee.
I mean, that's something that you would not have expected 5 years ago.
Certainly everyone's going to expect Tony Stark to look like Robert Downey Jr. for the foreseeable future. But then what do they do? Like, someday Robert Downey Jr. is not going to play Iron Man anymore. That's going to happen, and they're not going to want to stop making Iron Man movies.
Right.
Well, do you think they have to, reboot the cinematic universe, too?
I mean, I guess they've already done that with Spider-Man, right?
I guess they did, but that one, Spider-Man's, in a different movie continuity. Like, Spider-Man isn't in the same world as the Avengers and Thor because of some rights thing. He's in a different... and same with X-Men. X-Men are in their own little corner of the Marvel movie world. How do you keep updating those? How do you keep that fresh?
Hopefully, they won't have to keep dealing with that, at a rapid rate. I think one thing that's been really interesting to watch is for comic book fans, it's always been this. There's been kind of a bone of contention of they make a movie and they change stuff in the movie and they feel like they don't get it right, But now the movies are the canon. That's if you ask. The average person on the street, what does Iron Man look like? Like you said, it's Robert Downey Jr. And
I heard some people when the new Spider-Man movie came out, they were like, oh, that's weird that he built a web shooter on his hand. Like he has a machine on his wrist that shoots webs, as opposed to it being a biological function, like a little anus on his wrist. But that's actually how it was forever in the comic books. And Sam Raimi was the one that changed it. Now they changed it back.
Right. But now what I think you're starting to see is the comic books, having to bend to the ways of the movies. It's a total reversal of what it was like for years and years and years.
It seems like Marvel was just bought for an enormous amount of money by Disney. But it seems like the comic books are really like a factory or like a farm to seed these ideas that will be the movies, and that's where the real money is. Is that true?
Yeah, I think so. The
comic books are like a loss leader to come up with these characters.
Except they're not a loss leader. It would be more interesting if they were a loss leader. They would take more chances. The way that the corporate structure is built right now, and their business model is that all the comics have to be profitable on their own terms.
Oh, really?
So
is that at Marvel and DC?
I don't believe it's true for DC.
Mm-hmm.
It's been true for Marvel for the last maybe 10 or 15 years. If it was if there were loss leaders, then you could have some kind of crazy new concept, and they would just put that out as research and development. A friend of mine actually had a pretty good analogy, which is if you look at Marvel Entertainment as this big fancy restaurant, every night is totally packed. Marvel Comics, the publishing division, is like a cigarette machine in the lobby of the restaurant, and every once in a while the owners shake it loose and see what kind of change comes out.
It's not just the movies, it's the toys, the video games. I bet all those things are more profitable than the funny books.
Yeah, the merchandising just totally dwarfs.
A lot of, especially in these pre-Fantastic Four days, there's a lot of different eras and a lot of fads almost in comic books. Westerns are big, then horror comics, then romance or whatever. But after Fantastic Four, it's pretty much superheroes. Comic books are synonymous with superheroes to this day. Why did superheroes stick?
Well, there was also the Batman movie in 1966, which really kind of pounded the nails in the coffin of other genres, I think.
The Adam West Batman movie.
The Adam West Batman movie.
The greatest Batman movie of all time.
Or TV show, I guess. But
the movie too, though. There's a movie too.
Oh, was it a theatrical?
I believe so. I have 2 copies of it on DVD.
Okay, good. I would be really psyched if they started bringing back romance comics.
A recurring theme in the book is that everyone is all of a sudden worried that comic books are tanking and starts feeling around for a new job. Like, everyone seems perpetually ready for the comic book industry to explode. Is that still true? Do you think that they're still worried about it?
Yeah, I just by dint of the fact that it's part of publishing, it right now is a reason to worry about it. I think they have good reason to worry about it, and I don't think the comic book industry will ever totally go away, but they're not hiring huge numbers of people these days.
You think they're never really going away?
I don't think so. I mean, very few art forms really totally vanish, and I don't even necessarily think that they will get much smaller than they already are. They're really they sell a fraction of what they were selling 20 years ago.
How many copies does Amazing Spider-Man sell every month? Do you have a ballpark? Is it like 100,000? Is it 1 million? I wouldn't even know.
It is. I'm gonna guess it's between 50 and 100,000.
That's really not that much.
As I'm saying that, I'm thinking that's probably high. Mm-hmm. Whereas it was selling like 1 million 20 years ago.
Do you think going digital is going to be a major shift for Marvel at all?
Sure. I mean, I guess it has been already, to a degree. I think, hopefully people will, continue wanting to read. I don't know. I feel like my old codgerness is kind of coming out. I'm such a sucker for being able to hold a page.
Yeah, but I think it maybe will be like records. They still sell records, and you can go buy a record if you want. But it's most people are happy enough with the MP3 or getting it from iTunes or whatever it is. Like, I can't imagine they're going to stop publishing Spider-Man comics ever in our lifetime. But I can imagine them being harder to find, them being more of like a boutique item.
Yeah.
Lots of chaos at Marvel over the years. Lots of chaos at Marvel. Lots of discrepancies. Was it the same at DC?
Yeah, I don't know if it was just as chaotic, but there was definitely bloodletting and office politics, and I think Marvel maybe got the lion's share of outsized characters in the editorial offices, but DC has plenty of skeletons in the closet too.
Yeah, and they come up. I mean, a big one, which there's another book about, is Joe Shuster and the creation of Superman and him being screwed out of that.
Yeah,
and he pops up in your book too.
Yeah,
because he worked for Marvel.
Right. Was it Jerry Siegel actually was rather
the other Superman creator.
Right. And yeah, he sort of found himself doing proofreading at Marvel in the late 1960s. And it's sort of a sad image of the guy who co-created Superman is just anonymously bent over proofreading at the competition's offices.
Well, now that Marvel's owned by Disney, do you think that's a game changer for the company?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, Marvel will never go away. I mean,
it's kind of like, I don't love when big companies get bigger, just as a rule of thumb. And Disney now owns Star Wars, they own the Muppets. They're setting up the best crossover of all time. But it is somewhat reassuring to know that the Spider-Man rights aren't never gonna. He's never gonna really go away.
Yeah,
it's in the fine care of the people at Disney.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way it's yeah, it could go in a lot of different directions, but I do think that it's good for just the viability of the company. That there've been so many ways in which Marvel's been endangered over the years, and it's hard to imagine that the Walt Disney Company is going to just tank.
Yeah. They're set up to go for a while. Do you think anything has to change at Marvel for it to exist under Disney?
I think just by degrees. I don't think there's any huge qualitative shift in the way that they do things. I mean, it was already Ike Perlmutter who owned Marvel for the last 10 years before he sold it to Disney. He was already sort of ruling it with an iron fist, and I think that that was probably a good preparation for how Disney would do it.
Yeah.
It's a very corporate place.
Well, I love the book. I love I was familiar with a lot of these things. Like I said, I know who Stanley is, but I didn't know just how much he had contributed not only to Marvel Comics, which sounds silly because he's synonymous with Marvel Comics, but I didn't realize, reading about that initial run of all these characters they created in a row, it's really exciting. It's really interesting. How can people read the book?
I have a website, SeanHowe.com, and so if there's actually a link to take you to your choice of booksellers. rather than just sending you straight to Amazon.
But it's also, you can get it electronically. Is it on Kindle? I read it on iBooks.
Yeah, it's on pretty much all the major ebooks, and hopefully it's at your local bookstore. That would be my favorite way for people to find the book.
Are you still reading comic books now that the book is done? Are you like picking up anything monthly?
There's a Hawkeye comic book that's pretty great.
I've heard. I might have to check that out. I've heard that's really good.
It is really good.
Yeah,
you should.
That's cool. Who's drawing it?
I don't know how to pronounce his name. David AJA. Is the last name.
Yeah. Aha,
Maybe.
Aja. I think that's also a Steely Dan album. We'll cut that
it's
part
a good Steely Dan.
Cool. Well, Sean, thanks so much for writing the book. Loved it, and coming and talking today.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody, that is it for this week's Jeff Rubin Show. Next week, at long last, I will finally be posting the live Jeff Rubin Show we recorded at NY Podfest a few weeks ago. I know I've been hyping it for a while, but I am excited that everyone will finally be able to listen. You may recall me mentioning that it involves a lot of arguing about video games. Here is what it's going to sound like.
My pick for most tragic game is Nintendogs. I'm holding up the card. Like, not only can you guys not see it, there's people listening on headphones, like on a treadmill on this subway. Imagine how little they can see it. Nintendogs is my pick for most tragic game. And it's not because it's like the number 4 selling game of all time. Like, Nintendogs has sold more copies than every Zelda game combined. That alone would make it the most tragic game of all time. But I think what's so sad about Nintendogs is the idea of a child playing it instead of having an actual dog. Like, there's some legitimate tragedy and sadness there that they have love to give, and they're putting it into like a very glorified Tamagotchi. And I know the plot of Myst is very sad, it's very tragic, I couldn't follow it, but it sounds very sad. But Nintendogs has no plot. The plot is that you can't have a real dog. That's the plot of the game. And then, like, instead you were given a Nintendo DS. And as much as I love video games, nothing is more tragic than that.
As always, that new episode will be up on Tuesday, and don't forget that on Wednesdays, on every other Wednesday, there are new episodes of Bleep Bloop. This is one of those Wednesdays with a new episode, so check that out at collegehumor.com/Bleep Bloop. I will keep you posted about new Bleep Bloops, new Jeff Rubin shows, and, pretty much anything else I'm working on if you follow me on Twitter, where I am at Jeff Rubin Show. If you go to my Tumblr at jeffrubin.com, where, by the way, there is also a sign-up for a mailing list if you want to get emails when there's new episodes of the podcast. Of course, there is also the Facebook fan page and youtube.com/Jeff Rubin. Thank you so much for listening. Go check out Sean's book, Marvel Comics, The Untold Story. But for now, bye.